Excellent. Good morning. Today is Thursday, May 8th, and we are continuing our Talmud Shiur, our study of Gemara on marriage and divorce, and family life, broadly part of a larger curricular arc that we've been learning around the Jewish life cycle, which began this past fall. I am sending my regrets that I was not here last week. I was being given a ceremonial honor for 25 years in the rabbinate down at Temple Emmanuel in New York at a ceremony of graduation and honors provided by Hebrew Union College, my alma mater. And while Rabbi Platkow was scheduled to teach in my absence, she got a little bug and wasn't able to attend. So we canceled last minute. I hope it didn't throw you too much. And the fact that you're here today suggests that you have been able to roll with it and we're back in the saddle today. As a result, though, of the canceled class, I will be teaching on the morning of June the 5th. So we'll keep the same number of sessions that were originally scheduled. We'll just go one extra week. So really happy to be back with you. And I'd love to invite us to offer our blessing for study together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we're going to continue our conversation around marriage. The broad overview here, and this is a recap. So if you are catching up with the class because you weren't able to make one or more of the sessions so far, this being the third in our spring shiur, or if you just need a refresher because we last met 2 weeks ago, we've been looking at selections from Talmudic tractates that touch on the subject of Jewish marriage. As is typical of Talmud study, although the Talmud is arranged topically, so that you have this kind of nested hierarchy of texts that are grouped by first the order of the Talmud, or what's called a Seder, which is kind of a master collection, of which there are six, deriving exactly from the six orders of the Mishnah. Then each order has subunits, which are called tractates, or in Hebrew, a singular masechet, plural masechtot. A masechet literally means webbing, like the connective tissue between your digits, right? Between your fingers. This is masechet right here, this stuff. So the masechtot, or the tractates, are the connective tissue that frame each order of Talmud. So each of the six orders has masechtot, and we are variously looking at a handful of different masechtot, a handful of different tractates, each of which touches on marriage, though differently. So we've looked at Kiddushin, which means holiness, though we spent a long time about 3 weeks ago unpacking the concept of Kiddushin and of Kodesh, and how this term that seems to be associated, at least colloquially, with religious matters or behaviors that we associate with the realm of the spiritual. More accurately, Kodesh refers to any category of human behavior, human existence, where something or someone is set aside for a special purpose that cannot be used for any other purpose. We would use the word consecrated, right? So when a groom places a ring on the finger of the bride, he says, Harei at mikudeshet li. Behold, thou art consecrated unto me. Bitabadzo, which means with this ring, Kedat Moshe v'Yisrael, according to the law of Moses and Israel. That's the magic formula. Those are the words that actually enact the Kiddushin, the marriage, right? So before putting a ring on it and speaking those words, the couple is technically not married. After putting a ring on it while speaking those magic words, the couple is married. So the language has the effect of changing the status of both bride and groom. Um, and it does so through the word Kodesh. Mikudeshet literally means you are consecrated or sanctified. You are made holy unto me in the sense of not so much that I put you on a spiritual pedestal, but you are set aside for me in a loving relationship that is unlike anyone else in my life, including other people I love, right? So one spouse is loved differently from all other partners. That's the essence of marriage in the Jewish tradition, and or at least of monogamous marriage in the Jewish tradition, which, as we learned, is the rabbinic norm. I did a little bit more reading on this, and apparently there was a takana or a rabbinic edict issue somewhere, I think, in the ninth or 10th century by Rabbeinu Gershom, which actually forbade, it outlawed polygamous marriage in Jewish tradition. That would be too much of a detour for us to entertain today, but I did go back and figure out like when exactly was polygamy definitively outlawed, though it had not been conventional Jewish practice for quite some time, even though it is a biblical norm that can be identified by reading any number of stories from the Hebrew Bible of people who had multiple wives. So we are going to go a little bit deeper into the first some of the rituals of marriage and how they are expressed in the moment of the couple joining in this union. And then we're going to do just a little bit more of kind of like a zoomed out view on Talmudic philosophies around bringing children into a marriage, and the role of children in family life. And that will give us a lot to explore, and it'll probably be at least another week or two before we start touching on divorce. So we'll stay in the realm of marriage and family life, and then we'll entertain how divorce is enacted in the Jewish tradition and what that's all about. So I'd like to, any questions just of a general nature to help us catch up and all be on the same page before we dive into text?
And
you,
just
yeah, sure. Judy.
The statement is made by the groom. Does the wife have any role specifically to respond?
No. So in a traditional marriage, um, it is not bi-directional. It's a one-sided enterprise, right? So the groom uh, or the bride is betrothed unto the groom by the groom putting a ring on the finger of the bride and speaking the words, "Behold, thou art consecrated unto me," or "You are sanctified unto me with this ring as my wife, in keeping with the law of Moses and Israel." And it is not reciprocated, at least not in that moment. So there is no Jewish law requiring a woman to betroth the man, to put a ring on his finger and say, "You are consecrated unto me as my husband with this ring according to the law of Moses and Israel." Um, Having said that, 99.5% of the weddings I've ever conducted are double ring ceremonies, we call them, or egalitarian ring ceremonies, where the groom will put the ring on the finger of the bride and the bride will put the ring on the finger of the groom. My personal practice is I don't care who goes first. I'll even ask the couple who goes first, like which one of you wants to say it first. And what gets changed is the conjugation of a couple of words. Jane, our resident Hebrew expert, knows that Hebrew is a language that must agree, like the Romance languages, in gender and number. So when the bride puts the ring on the finger of the groom in a reform ceremony, a ceremony that I lead, she will say, "Hare ata mikudashli." "Behold, you are consecrated to me with this ring," etc. The rest of the formula is the same. It's just that the words at mikudeshet means you, feminine, singular, mikudeshet are consecrated or sanctified for a woman. And when the bride is speaking to her fiance, soon to be husband, the language is ata mikudash. You, masculine, are consecrated masculine. Other than that, though, it's the same language. But again, this is a reform innovation that is not required under Jewish law, and Orthodox practitioners will not do. So next week, we have an interesting opportunity. No, sorry, 2 weeks. On Thursday, the 22nd, we'll teach them Talmud in the morning. And then I have an unusual Thursday afternoon wedding down at Mamaroneck Beach and Yacht Club. So I think chuppah is called for 4 o'clock or 4:30. The bride is a woman who was actually in my very first confirmation class at WRT. So confirmation class of 2004. Lovely woman. Her mom occasionally studies in our Talmud class, so I don't know if Nancy, are you here today? Nancy Siegel's daughter, Abby Liebman, is getting married to a wonderful fellow named Josh. So Josh identifies as modern Orthodox and has a wonderful rabbi who works in New York City, though I think full-time he's a lawyer at like Davis Polk. But he moonlights as an Orthodox rabbi. Um, it's really actually very sweet for me. He's like 28 years old, and he's a newlywed himself. So this is his first co-officiating with a Reform rabbi. I've actually co-officiated with Orthodox rabbis many times, and we're talking this afternoon. We've really enjoyed getting to know each other. That ceremony will be a single ring ceremony because that's the Orthodox law. However, the groom would like to wear a wedding ring just as part of his married life, so we decided that at the ketubah signing before they walk down the aisle under the chuppah, the bride will present her groom with a ring, place it on his finger, and instead of saying Harei ata mikudash le, behold, thou art consecrated, which is legal language, right? It's the halachic formula. We came up with the fact that she will recite the popular verse from the Song of Songs, Ani lidodi v'dodi li. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. So it's poetic, it conveys the right idea, and it certainly operates as a formula of dedication or consecration, but it isn't the official halachic language. So it's a kind of a fun example of how rabbis who are, working together across different denominations can actually meet in the middle and come up with creative ways around halachic strictures. So we're having fun putting together this ceremony. Um, but the honest truth is that when I conduct a wedding, more often than not, somebody will come up to me at the cocktail hour afterward and ask me, "Are you Reform, conservative? Like, what are you?" They know I'm not Orthodox just from the way I dress, but they're not sure if I'm Reform or conservative because the fact of the matter is the Jewish wedding is a Jewish wedding. It's like how many Reformed Jews use an Orthodox Haggadah? Like, if you ever used a Maxwell House Haggadah, that's the Haggadah. Like, that's the script. So it's not like there's so much deviation in this ritual across denominations. Basically, what I do under a chuppah is the same as my counterparts who identify as conservative or Orthodox, with a few exceptions. That bilateral ring exchange being the preeminent exception. Thanks, Judy. Good question. And of course that speaks to the fact that the rabbinic norms around marriage and that are expressed in the wedding are still not egalitarian, right? The rabbis did enact Jewish law and practice that gave women protections that they never had in the biblical period. I mean, what what demonstrates that foremost is the fact that the Bible never actually talks about marriage. It's just a man takes a woman, which implies sexual congress, and then she's his wife. Like that's all that happened. The rabbis actually placed ritual norms and legal norms around this that did provide women in the earliest part of the rabbinic era with protections that they never previously enjoyed. Um, and foremost among them, the guarantee that they would be, furnished with clothing, shelter, and what the Talmud calls marital satisfaction. Um, and if not, the bride actually has grounds for divorce. So, divorce is actually a protection for women in Jewish law. The idea of needing a get and having a mechanism where women would not be, basically sexual slaves or chattel of their husbands is an important innovation in rabbinic life. Okay, so we're going to look at a little Gemara on how this gets done, and we're looking at tractate Ketubot, Daf 7b, page 7b. So I'm going to bring it up on the screen. And okay, so looking at the top here, Tanu Rabbanan. And just as a reminder for those of you who have been kind of my longest term students, Tanu, one of the many words in Jewish life for to teach, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught. And it's a specific word that indicates it comes from the Mishnaic period, but was not part of the Mishnah. When the Mishnah is quoted, it says mitane. Tanu, derived from the same word, is a tell. It's an indication that we're talking about something called a baraita, which is the word I've highlighted down below. It doesn't actually say that in the Hebrew text above, but Steinsaltz, our editor, our redactor of this specific text in translation, provides that for us in the plain print as a gloss. Baraita being an extra Mishnaic teaching, so it comes from the Mishnaic era, say somewhere between the century before Jesus, compiling teachings all the way up until the middle part of the third century of the Common Era. So, 300 years of rabbinic teaching are compiled both in the Mishnah and in various extra Mishnaic teachings known as Baraitot, or a Baraita singular. All right, so what's this Baraita all about? Sorry. It says, Mivarchin Birkat Chatanim. Okay, these are actually roots that you know. So if you see how I'm highlighting just the inner letters of the word Mivarchin, if it sounds a little like Mivorach, exactly, it's the same root. Bet Reish Kaf Baruch, right? So Mivarchin means to bless. One blesses or they bless. What do they bless? Well, they bless something called a Birkat Chatanim. Birkat, again, is from Baruch. The Hebrew word for a blessing is bracha, right? So if I say a bracha, or more commonly in the Ashkenazi pronunciation, say a bracha, right? When the word bracha is conjugated with the specific kind of bracha that you're saying, it transforms the word into birkat, right? So the blessing over a meal, right? The bracha over a meal, where the word meal is mazon, bracha plus mazon equals birkat hamazon, right? This is just a little bit of Hebrew grammar for you. Um, Bracha plus mezuzah, the blessing you say over putting a mezuzah up on your door, birkat mezuzah. Um, the blessing over the wine, Birkat Yain, right? Or Birkat Borei Pri Hagafen. So Birkat Chatanim, literally a chatan, you probably know this, is a groom. So the Birkat Chatanim means the benediction of the grooms, and says Beveit Chatanim, in the house of the grooms, when the bride enters into the wedding canopy. So this is just talking about when you say certain things to enact the marriage. We'll unpack this a little bit more. So as you can see from the English, one recites the benediction of the grooms in the house of the grooms when the bride enters into the wedding canopy. And Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer here, Af beveta Eirusin mivarchin ota. One recites it even in the house of the betrothal at the time of the betrothal. So there's a debate over when you say this official statement that or this official blessing that announces that the bride and groom have gotten married. One is suggesting, or the predominant opinion, the community of sages says you say it right there in the groom's house or wherever people have convened for the purpose of marriage. Rabbi Yehuda says you can actually say it at the time of the betrothal. I mentioned this perhaps in passing 2 weeks ago, but the Jewish wedding ceremony actually used to be two separate ceremonies. So there was a ceremony of betrothal, and then there was a ceremony of marriage or grooming, right? So one word for marriage in the Jewish tradition is the begrooming of somebody. Don't think of grooming in any sense, whether, combing one's hair or sexual grooming. It's not that kind of groom. I'm using the word groom as in a bridegroom as a verb, which is not linguistically accurate. Um, so in antiquity, there were actually three things that would happen around marriage. There was a shidduch, which was the arrangement or the bringing together of the couple. Then there was a betrothal, and then there was a marriage. And each one had customs associated with it. I happen to know that at least one person in our class has participated in some of those customs because my sister was married under Orthodox auspices. So my mom and the mother of the groom participated in a ritual that's part of the betrothal custom called Tanaim, which involves breaking a plate before the bride and groom are led to the chuppah. Has anyone ever seen this before besides my mom? Yeah, so that was interesting. There are all sorts of customs surrounding the announcement that my child is going to marry his or her child, right? And they're brought together, and then there are various, blessings and mazel tovs that are exchanged. And then formerly, in other words, centuries and centuries ago, in antiquity, there'd be a ceremony where the couple would actually meet for the first time and be betrothed. And then a few months later, the parents would host a wedding party at which the blessing of the grooms would be recited. We're going to learn, you actually are probably familiar with what this last blessing is. So three parts. The shidduch, the making of the arranged marriage, the betrothal, the bride and groom meet for the first time and seal the deal over a cup of wine. But they don't seal the deal in any way other than with words, by the way. And then finally, the part where they exchange rings, a special set of blessings is recited that we're going to get to momentarily, and then all the other customs and it's interesting what's not mentioned here, but we'll get to that in a minute as well. So over time, over much time, most of these customs merged. Throughout the Jewish world, of course, historically, and even in some parts of the Jewish world today, arranged marriages were and in some places are the norm. How many of you are fans of Shtisel? Okay, great TV show on Netflix. I think it's still there. If you've never seen it, you got to go watch Shtisel. Great TV show. Um, Fantastic TV show, both funny and heartbreaking and wonderful about ultra-Orthodox life in Jerusalem. And apparently a prequel or a spin-off is being released called Kugel, if I'm not mistaken, which is about Shulam Shtissel's brother Nucham, who's played by the brilliant Sassoon Gabay, one of the great Israeli actors of our time. So highly recommend when that's released on Netflix, we should all check that out. So in that world, in the Haredi world, marriages are still arranged, right? And the bride and groom have very little interaction with each other. There are dating customs, but usually there's like a couple of dates where the bride and groom like interact over tea, usually in a hotel lobby. Some of you have probably seen this scene unfold if you visited Jerusalem, with all the people in there very, they're dressed up, but you can tell they're wearing their dress hats and their dress shittles and whatnot. Like the young women aren't wearing shittles, but the dress clothing. And they're, trying to see if it's a match. But most of that decision is out of their hands. Like at the point where they're sitting down for tea and a pastry, that's pretty much like this is going to happen. And these are people who are either still adolescent or barely out of adolescence when this is happening. Um, Therefore, so there's a shidduch, there's a setup or a match, betrothal, and blessing over the couple now all happen at the same time, those latter two parts. So if you think about Jewish life and Jewish law, if you let's imagine it's Shabbos dinner. Okay, so it's tomorrow night. And you raise up a glass of wine at the beginning of the meal and you make Kiddush. You say Borei Pri Hagafen and then you bless God for the day. That's the long Kiddush, but that's actually Kiddush. What you're sanctifying is the day. You're not blessing the wine. You're blessing God for the wine. Blessed are you, creator of the fruit of the vine. You don't say bless the wine. Blessed are you, O God. Baruch atah Adonai, etc. B'rei pri hagafen. Thank you, God, for the wine. And then thank you, God, for the Sabbath day, which is holy, set apart, consecrated, different than any other day, right? I love Shabbat differently than I love any other day of the week. Okay. Every time you have another glass of wine at a Shabbat table, do you have to say Kiddush? No, of course not. One Kiddush, one bracha covers the whole meal. All right, now, what two rituals in Jewish life require that you make more than one Kiddush in the same ceremony?
One is Seder,
One is Seder. Good. How many cups of wine at Seder, Dad?
or
Four,
at
plus
least
a fifth, which is not drunk, the,
Elijah's
the
cup.
Elijah cup. And the real reason actually is because there's a dispute over how many times God promised to liberate the Jewish people. Uh, it is four, but there's a fifth option. So there's a fifth cup of wine that doesn't get drunk. That's actually the halachic workaround. That's a tangent. I'm not going to fully go down that rabbit hole. But at a Seder, each cup of wine represents a different stage in the deliverance of the Jewish people from bondage and is spread out throughout the Seder there are two before the meal and two after the meal. One is recited at the very beginning, one is recited kind of over the storytelling. Kiddush, sorry, one is right before the meal, one is with Birkat Hamazon, and one is at the very, very end. So four cups of wine, and each time you actually make a beret pri hagafen because each one is sanctified for a different reason and is contributes to the unfolding of the ritual of the Seder. The other ritual in Jewish life where you say Kiddush more than once is a wedding. You do it twice. You can have one Kiddush cup or two Kiddush cups, but you raise up a Kiddush cup at the beginning, near the beginning of the ceremony, and you say a blessing thanking God for the betrothal of the bride to the groom. So we raise up a Kiddush cup and say, hooray, this couple is getting married. Effectively, you actually say, thank you, God, for all of the sanctified relationships and also for announcing in the Torah, Leviticus chapter 18, all of the forbidden relationships, right? What we're doing under the chuppah is squarely within the boundaries of Jewish law. This is not somebody marrying his sister-in-law, God forbid. So we say, thank you, God, for the permitted and the forbidden relationships. Blessed are you, eternal God, who sanctifies the people of Israel through the ritual of marriage beneath the chuppah. That's the essence of that prayer. That's the betrothal blessing. And then you say, B'rei pri hagafen l'chaim, and the couple drinks. That is, remember, originally that was a standalone ceremony of betrothal. It was merged with the second ceremony that was kind of like at the time of the wedding party, the parents would throw a party, bring the couple together, and they would do a long form set of blessings that includes a second Kiddush. So in the modern Jewish wedding ceremony, both happen in very short succession. Modern Jewish wedding is 15 minutes. I kind of zhuzh it a little bit more, and you got bridesmaids and groomsmen walking down. It can run to a half hour. If you're standing there for 45 minutes, somebody's doing this wrong. So that's my view. There's just no excuse that this ritual needs to be more than a half hour. So besides, you're standing, when you're the rabbi, you don't want a ceremony of 45 minutes. You're standing in front of 200 hungry Jews who are wondering when the hors d'oeuvres are coming. It's not a good, it's the hardest part of my work life is being the one thing standing between 200 Jews and dinner. It's not good. So you take a glass of wine and you say a special set of brachot, and then they are not just betrothed, but now they're married. Now they are consecrated each unto the other. Um, and you make Kiddush again because it's two separate ceremonies, right? All right, just a little fun fact about Kiddushes. Audrey, unmute.
I just want to say that I watched a talk with the actors from Kugel, Rodov Sholom, and the Jewish book groups and it's we've watched I think 3 episodes on Izzy. It's the
Oh yeah,
Israel.
it's not on Netflix
Know
yet.
it. Yeah, you must know it, and it's dark.
Yeah,
It's I would say it doesn't leave you with the same good feelings that
a
Stissel
little
did.
bit interesting.
He's not a nice character. I mean, he's
No,
a
I mean
character
he's an SOB in Stesel, so
at best. At best,
at best. Okay.
yeah. And his poor daughter has to pay the price.
Oh, okay. Now I really want to see it. Great. Okay, so now let's carry forward in our study. Um, hang on 1 second here. All right. I just am looking for the tab that I have several tabs open today. All right. Um, right. Thank you. So we had this prevailing opinion from the sages that you say this blessing of the grooms, as it says, in the house of the grooms when the bride enters into the canopy. So at the time of the chuppah, they're suggesting, is when you say the Birkat Chatanim. What is this blessing of the grooms? I promise you we're getting there. Rabbi Yehuda has a different opinion. He says, no, you actually say it in the house of betrothal, and there's an explanation that says, Amar Abaye. Abaye said, Uviudashanu, what Rabbi Judah was teaching, mipnei shemityachedima. Uh, there was a concern over the appearance that they were secluded together. Um, there's this, you want to remove doubt that they have conjugated before saying the blessings, right? Because at the moment you say the blessings, you are married. And the order is actually that sexual, that coitus happens after the chuppah. And in the traditional world, it used to be the case that it happened immediately after. Okay. So now we get into a further discussion of the same Tanya Idach. It is taught as well in another Baraita, but now we've switched languages to Aramaic. Why exactly, I don't know. Mevarchim birkat chatanim beveit chatanim. So you say the blessing of the grooms in the house of the grooms. U birkat eirusin beveit eirusin. So they're actually now saying, no, wait a minute, there's a workaround here. So you say the blessing of the grooms at the time or at the place of the chuppah, and the blessing of betrothal, you would say in the house of betrothal. It's a little bit confusing because the chronological order is reversed. It should be betrothal before chuppah, but you get the idea. Birkat Eirusin mai mevarech. So this blessing of betrothal, what does one actually bless, right? What is the blessing of betrothal? Um, with regard to the benediction of the betrothal, what formula does one recite is the translation provided here. Ravin bar Rav Ada, this fellow, the Rabba bar Rav Ada. So we've got two different citations, or one citation attributed to two different rabbis, Ravin bar Rav Ada and Rabba bar Rav Ada. Um, Probably two sons of the same Rav Ada said, uh, Tarvaihu Mishame de Rav Yehuda Amri, in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, who taught. Okay, here's the formula. Baruch ata Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu. Isn't it nice when you can read Talmud and know all the words? Okay, so the formula they're saying for the blessing of betrothal is, Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the world, who has sanctified us with mitzvot, vitzivanu, commanding us, al ha'arayot, concerning the forbidden relationships. Remember how I said there's a special blessing before the couple takes their vows and exchanges rings, where you thank God for all the relationships that are forbidden as well as the permitted. The asar lanu et arusot, literally forbidding sexually impermissible relationships. The hitir lanu et nisuot, and permitting us the permitted relationships, al yedei chuppah v'kiddushin, by means of the chuppah and the ritual of marriage. All right, how do they translate it here? That's my own translation. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, not gender sensitive, who sanctified us through his mitzvot and commanded us concerning the forbidden relatives. Now, it's basically the declaration, this is kosher, right? The bride and the groom are not, you know, siblings, God forbid. He's not
Oh,
marrying somebody he's not allowed to marry, and prohibited to us those women who are betrothed. So you can't marry somebody who's already betrothed to somebody else, and permitted to us those women who are married by means of the wedding canopy and betrothal. In other words, the person that this groom is about to marry is totally kosher. It's a totally legitimate marriage. Thank you, God. All right, reading on. Rav Acha, uh, Bre de Rava, so Rabbi Acha, the son of Rabba, Misayemba Mishemei de Rav Yehuda, concluded in the name of Rabbi Judah, Rabbi Yehuda, Baruch atah Adonai mekadesh Yisrael al yedei chuppah v'kiddushin. By the way, that is the line I say I say this blessing every time I do a wedding. As recently as Saturday night, though the Reform Rabbinic Manual, the Reform Rabbi's Manual, does not include the part about the forbidden relationships, which I think is silly because we do adhere to that stricture. Like, we don't want people marrying their siblings-in-law, God forbid. But the Reform Manual just says, "Thank you, God, for all the permitted relationships." When I'm when I'm officiating with my Orthodox buddy in 2 weeks, he will say forbidden and permitted. That's a liturgical choice that I would have advised my, Reform forebears not to excise from the liturgy. I don't see what's wrong with saying there are prohibited relationships and there are permitted relationships. End of story. But okay, I'm not a professional liturgist. All right, so that's the blessing of betrothal. All right, I'm going to skip a paragraph or two. And then, so just one paragraph down, the next little segment says, Tanu Rabbanan mivarchin Birkat Chatanim be'asara kol shiva. So the rabbis taught, again, a baraita, because there's the Tanu, the giveaway. One one offers the Birkat Chatanim, this blessing of the grooms, which is a term we still haven't figured out what they're referring to, but we will, I promise, in about 50 seconds. But asara, literally with 10. So in a minyan, you need a quorum to recite the blessing of the grooms, which we have a different name for it. Kol Shiva, literally for all 7 days. So a traditional Jewish wedding ceremony actually lasts for 7 days. You do the thing once under a chuppah, but then the same blessings are recited in the home of the newlyweds for 7 days. Has anyone ever observed that custom of, okay, Audrey, you've seen that of people coming over and there's nosh and there's music and fun and whatnot. And the heart of that ceremony in the home for 7 days, which is nice because it's like a joyful counterpart to the Shiva of mourning, right? So there's a Shiva of newlywed as well. Amar Rav Yehuda, the same Rabbi Judah, comments, V'hu sheba'u panim chadashot. And that is the case. He says, no, you only have to do the blessing of the grooms for 7 days in the case of people who didn't previously make the wedding. It's the reason you have 7 days of this is only if there are people who couldn't make it who want to celebrate the bride and groom. Now, finally, at the end of the daf, my mevarech. What is this blessing of the grooms that we've been talking about for several paragraphs? What are we actually saying? Amar Rav Yehuda, the same Rabbi Judah, who apparently knows a lot about this, he says, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shehakol bara lichvodo, who's created all for his glory. And what we're going to do is we're now going to see a sequence of blessings. How many blessings are recited at the time that the bride and groom actually take their marriage vows?
7.
7. We know the blessing of the grooms, which is the Talmudic term provided in this sugya, this section, as the Sheva Berakhot, right? Some of you probably were wondering this for the last 20 minutes. Like, when's he going to get to the Sheva Berakhot? This is it. It just goes by a different name in the Talmud. So they call it Birkat Chatanim, the blessing of the grooms. but it has passed down to us colloquially in Jewish tradition as Sheva Berakhot, which is a more generic name. 7 blessings. Well, there could be, 7 random blessings. No, specifically 7 blessings that are pronounced upon the groom and the bride sealing the deal with a ring and the formula. All right, so again, 2 separate ceremonies that merged into one. One is the blessing of betrothal. One is the betrothal, which has its own blessing, which talks about forbidden and permitted relationships. Thank you, God, for those. And then these days, at the same time, back to back, the ring goes in between these 2 sets of blessings, and then afterwards, Sheva Brachot. And now we're going to actually look at the formula for the Sheva Brachot. So what are we actually thanking God for at this time? So this one says the first blessing is Shahakol Bara Lichvodo. So, and all of these, by the way, are going to be Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam formula, which is standard blessing formula, or the building blocks of Jewish prayer, begin with these 6 words. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam. On to the next side of the daf, or the next daf, 8a, Shakol bara lichvodo, who has made everything for the glory of God. And v'yotzer ha'adam. So this is an abbreviation of what you actually say, which is Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Yotzer Ha'adam. And it goes on to say, and the third blessing is, Yotzer Ha'adam, blessed are you, eternal God, etc., creator of humankind. Okay, third blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher yatzar et ha'adam b'tzalmo, literally who has created humanity in the divine image, b'tselem demut tavnito, in the likeness of God's very form, v'itkin lo mimenu binyan ad ead, and who has established out of God's self a building or a structure that lasts forever, which is really interesting. Like what they're suggesting about this poetic way of referring to God's creation of humankind. The purpose of it is v'yitkin lo mimenu, God created humanity in the image of God in order to establish for God, v'yitkin lo mimenu, out of him, meaning out of God, binyan, a physical structure, ade ad, which is like leolam va'ed. Ade ad is a poetic way of saying forever. So by giving human form to the divine image, God established an eternal physical manifestation of the divine. So if you think only Christians are the ones to speak in the language of the divine made incarnate, think again. That's actually a Jewish notion that Christianity appropriated. Christianity said, no, there was one person who was the physical incarnation of the divine. Judaism says, no, every person is a physical incarnation of the divine. We're all the image of God turned flesh. Quite a brilliant comment here. And very interesting that this is the third thing you would say to a bride and groom right after they take their vows. Baruch atah Adonai yotzer ha'adam. Blessed are you, eternal God, creator of humankind. All right, so that's the third blessing, though honestly the numbers are off here because these days you begin with another Borei Pri Hagafen. So Borei Pri Hagafen is 1, Yotzer, Vara, what is it? Bara lichvodo, Shakol bara lichvodo, everything created for God's glory, for the kavod of Adonai. Did I lose you, by the way? Was there a freeze in the... It froze for a moment. Yeah, I got a note saying that my connection is unstable. That sometimes happens around the office. I apologize. It's a Wi-Fi thing. You can hear me now, though?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So normally this is actually blessing number 2, who created everything for the kavod, or the glory of God. Blessing number 3 is who created humankind. Blessing number 4 is the one about the divine image and the eternal form or eternal structure. All right, the next one, blessing number 5, or what they call 4. Sos tasis v'tagel ha'akara. I love this one. May the barren one rejoice. It doesn't actually say, may the barren city of Jerusalem greatly rejoice. It just says, may the barren one, sos tasis v'tagel ha'akara, and akara is a barren woman. So it says, so may the barren woman rejoice. B'kibutz baneha letocha b'simcha. In the ingathering of her children all together with joy. Baruch atah Adonai mesamech Tzion bevaneha. Blessed are you, Adonai, who causes Zion to rejoice in her children. This is a wild blessing. I call this the "it's good for the Jews" blessing. When when two Jewish people who are in love decide they're going to build a chuppah, which is a home, and a life together, this is about the strengthening and the perpetuation of the Jewish people, and it is a metaphor, a poetic image of the ingathering of the exiles of the Jewish people under the chuppah represents a return to Jerusalem. Right? So you can see like a lot of the master themes of the Jewish tradition, of the Jewish mythos or myth, capital M, not a disparaging word. It's actually a word that I think gives a lot of honor to the master story of the Jewish people. So our foundational myths talk a lot about the theme of exile and dispersion leading to reunion and redemption. Like that's a master theme of the Jewish myth. It kind of is a master arc of Jewish history, Jewish memory, and Jewish destiny. Is that we go from being degraded by slavery, dispersed by exile, returned, reunited, redeemed. That's the arc of Jewish history and Jewish destiny. And the Jewish wedding is a microcosm of that. I call the chuppah a diorama of all Jewish time, right? So when I talk to couples, like, what are you actually doing there? You're actually creating a human diorama that tells the Jewish story. That begins with two people who used to be separate entities, as it were, in exile from each other and from God. And through their joining together in marriage, they are recreating in microcosm the master story of the Jewish people. Again, that goes from dispersion and exile to reunion and restoration and redemption. So there are lots of themes, and the Sheva Berakhot is this absolutely brilliant long form poem framed along 7 blessings that tells this story and that puts God at the center of the story and not just human agency. Like, this is not a love story. This is a story about God's design for the Jewish people and even more God's design for the universe. So we have to finish the Sheva Berakhot. Let me go back to the text and then we'll talk about it. All right. So we've gone to the restoration of Jerusalem, once barren, now reunited with her children, right? You get the poetry here? And then the 5th blessing, or what is actually the 6th in the way they're commonly recited today, Sameach tisamach re'im ahuvim. I love this phrase, Sameach, from Simcha, or Chag Sameach. Sameach means rejoice, tisamach, rejoice. So rejoice, rejoice, but it's a conventional poetic way of saying really, really rejoice. Rejoice, in the libretto of Handel's Messiah, rejoice greatly is Sameach tisamach, right? It's the tisamach after Sameach is works as an emphasizer, and so the grammar here, it's poetic, but Sameach tisamach, bring great joy. I don't like that. I would say rejoice greatly. Re'im ahuvim, re'im are friends. The line from Leviticus that we're reading in this week's parsha is Ve'ahavta l're'acha kamocha. You shall love your re'ah as yourself. We usually say neighbor, but a re'ah is actually a friend or a companion. So re'im ha'ahuvim, beloved, friends who are also lovers, right? Not just any kinds of friends, but friends who love. So greatly rejoice, O friends who are in love. Kisamechacha yitzircha began Eden mikedem. Just as your creatures, O God, God is always the address of a blessing, began Eden mikedem, in the Garden of Eden from the very first. So just as your creatures have rejoiced, and again, this is about God's design for all humanity, right? God built human beings as a living image of the divine in order to establish God's presence on earth, God's form for all time. And now the whole point of the wedding is that this is perhaps the pinnacle of how human beings might experience joy, through loving partnership with another person. Kisamechacha yitzircha began Eden mikeden. Just as your creatures have rejoiced even in the Garden of Eden of old, in ancient times. In other words, a wedding is also not just about the restoration of the Jewish people from exile to redemption, it is also about recreating the perfection and bliss of the Garden of Eden. So a wedding both looks backward to earliest time in Jewish memory, in Jewish mythology, and it looks ahead to messianic redemption. And that's where we're getting, before I take my parents' comments, the final blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bara sason v'simcha. So blessed are you, Adonai, eternal our God, creator of the world. Asher bara sason v'simcha, who has created joy and gladness. Chatan v'chala, that one's easy, bride and groom, or groom and bride. Gila, another word that means joy. Rina, another word that means joy. Ditza, another word that means joy. Chedva, another word that means joy. Ahava, love. Achava, friendship. Shalom, peace, contentment, wholeness, completion. Reut, friendship. Of course, it works better in Hebrew. So, Gila, Rina, Ditza, Chedva, Ahava, Achava, Shalom, Vereut. All of these pairs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Plus, Sason v'simcha, 9, 10, 11, 12. Chatan v'chalas. I don't know if there's a significance to 12 nouns in this phrase, but there are 12 things that are being celebrated. Mehera, swiftly, Adonai Eloheinu, O eternal our God. Yishama be'arei Yehuda, may there be heard in the cities of Judah, uvechutzot Yerushalayim, and all the way to the outskirts of Jerusalem. Kol sason v'kol simcha, the sound of gladness and the sound of rejoicing. Kol chatan v'kol kala, the sound of the groom and the voice of the groom and the voice of the bride. Kol mitzhalot chatanim mechupatam, the sounds of celebrations coming from the chuppahs of the groom, une'arim mimishte neginatam, and the melodies of children at their feasts. Baruch atah Adonai mesameach chatanim hakala. Blessed are you, eternal God, who causes the bride, or causes the groom to rejoice with the bride. And by the way, word for word, with the exception of B'rei Pri Hagafen, that is exactly the text of the Sheva Berakhot today. Not one word is different. So we find it for the first time here in the Gemara. Okay, mom and dad.
Could you go back to that section on the Garden of Eden?
Yep, the sixth blessing.
Yeah. That's not the example that I would have cited.
What would you have cited?
About the kindness of God to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. That's not the way I remember the story.
Yeah, right? Pretty wild. That is absolutely, I think, a revisionist history. The Garden of Eden ends in weeping.
Exile and pillars of fire. And,
Right. So the garden being barred from human reentry. So, that gives us, I think you're absolutely right. And I think the right question to ask is, I would not assume that is not a deliberate choice. In other words, I think that's absolutely a deliberate literary artistic choice on the part of the rabbis who wrote these blessings, is to revise the history of the Garden of Eden and basically say, look, the goal here is that the direction in which Judaism moves is, of course, in a direction of moral and human progress. So much so that when the Messiah comes, everything will look like a wedding feast, right? We have this image of a world made whole. Call it the Messianic era, call it a world redeemed, call it, the next Olam Haba. That image is derived not only from our imagination, but from what we learn about the Garden of Eden before the fall. But I wouldn't use the fall. The fall is a Christian term. Before the exile, before taking the fruit. So in a way, we're hoping to return the world to its pristine beginnings. Or at least we want to capture the joy, right? It's like what Joni Mitchell sang in Woodstock. which was then covered by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, right? We are stardust, we are golden, and we've got to get ourselves back to the garden. Like that's this image. It's a utopian vision, but I think it's intentional. And I think the literary irony behind it is also intentional. I think it wants you to read it and say, wait a minute, the Garden of Eden ended in misery. But maybe, just maybe, with this couple coming together under the chuppah, we might be able to recapture God's original design for creation, which was not dross and suffering, which I think is this wonderful, like, one of the, again, what are the master motifs of the Jewish tradition? One of them is that there is a difference between the way things are and the way they ought to be. Right? We live in a world of corruption, dross, suffering. Um, Rabbi Jack Stern of blessed memory gave many benedictions, and some of them he often used the adjective shabby to describe the world, which I always love. It's a great word, first of all, but nothing chic about it. It's not shabby chic. Like the world is not in the best repair, and it's our goal to rehab it. Um, I think we rehabilitate the world sometimes through social action and social justice. That is also tikkun olam. But the Kabbalists, Jewish mystics, going back to the Middle Ages, had a vision that tikkun olam was enacted through uh, through human love, right? And so that the connection of one spark of the divine to another, one divine image plus another, who meet in love and who unite their fates and their futures together, are actually participating in a cosmic tikkun ha'olam. They are restoring the world to the optimal condition with which God had in mind in designing the universe. If it surprises you that the themes of this Sheva Berakhot text are this spiritually elevated, this heady, that kind of delights me. I love the Sheva Berakhot. I think it's one of the greatest contributions in all of Jewish literature. I think this is one of the most absolutely beautiful and brilliant poems in all literature. Because in Seven Blessings, it says so much about how the Jewish imagination understands the world, our purpose in it, and how the divine operates within it. So it gives me such joy to share the Sheva Brachot with couples. And when I meet with couples before the wedding, I do spend a long time in this didactic frame. So what I'm sharing with you today is a part of a longer form discussion that I've had literally hundreds of times with couples. And someday I hope to write it down because I don't know if I've ever seen it all written out. A lot of this is just derived from my own understanding of the text and my deep reading of the poem, of the poetry of the Sheva Brachot. I think what it's trying to convey is profound. And it's suggesting that human love is actually an expression or human partnership more than love, because love is only mentioned once in the Sheva Brachot. But human partnership, reim hahuvim, being both partners, friends, and lovers, the essence of a good marriage, um, is part of God's design for how we either get back to Eden or, more importantly, how we rebuild the world in the more perfect image that God had in mind from the very first. Not the failed Eden, but the Eden that could be. Beautiful. Other thoughts, comments, questions on the Sheva Brachot? It's quite nice when the Talmud just gives us something wholesale that we're familiar with. And what's even more nice is if any of you have ever stood under a chuppah, either with your Rea Ahuva, your beloved partner, or with your children, or perhaps you've, attended other Jewish weddings. Every time you've heard those blessings, I'll bet you had no idea what was actually being pronounced. But it is just a magnificent set of comments. And it's the first thing you say to a couple right after they do the legal thing. The legal thing being Hareyat mikudeshet li b'tabat zo kedat Moshe v'Yisrael. Behold, thou art consecrated to me with this ring, according to the law of Moses in Israel, which is honestly not the most elevated language. That is what my professor David Aaron, professor of Bible at HUC in Cincinnati, calls performative speech. Not performative in a disparaging way. It is speech that actually performs a function, right? So, in other words, it was believed that by saying the words abracadabra, you would actually produce the result of the magic. Abracadabra is Aramaic, which means I create as I speak. Abracadabra is directly from Aramaic. It is an Aramaic phrase. So it's a performative language. Or, for instance, here's a great example. The oath of office, right? That actually is the thing you have to say in order to be president, whether or not you understand what it means to uphold the Constitution, which by the president's own admission, he's not sure about. Okay. But he did say those things. He said the words, right? Like every president before him. That's performative speech. So you have to say the thing. You have to say, Hareyat mikudeshet li b'tabat zo kedat Moshe v'Yisrael, or you're not married. Without the words, you haven't actually done the deed, even with the ring. Okay. Len, do you have a comment?
I was just wondering, doesn't the Muslim wedding and the Hindu wedding sort of copy the blessing, the idea of the blessings?
I don't know. I've never attended a Muslim wedding,
I've
though I
been to
have.
two of them, and I think they do. They're very similar.
It wouldn't surprise me. Remember, our tradition is older, even the rabbinic tradition. I mean, Muslims are at least 500 years, 600 years after this. This language was developed pretty early on. The formula of blessings probably dates from, before the time Jesus ever walked the earth. And these blessings may be as old as 2,000 years ago. Mishnaic, in other words. They're all Mishnaic. We know that because all the passages we read began with Tanu or Tanya, specific words that meant teaching in the Mishnaic era. And I've been to a Zoroastrian wedding, which is very, very close in some ways to a Jewish wedding. So I'll ask my Zoroastrian friend Darius Lakdawala how the blessings actually function. It wouldn't surprise me if there's more commonality than difference among these traditions. Thank you. Judy?
I have to look back at our Hindu wedding because there was I think also in an ultra-Orthodox wedding, there's an encircling
Yes.
of the
Right.
groom.
So
And I know that took place also in our wedding. Now it's a long time ago, but I'm going to now get it out and look at it.
yeah, and just to clarify, this is for your daughter,
Yes.
right? Not your own. Just in case people are wondering about Judy's religious affiliations. But when Maya married Sidhu, that was a Hindu wedding. Hindu and Jewish? Oh, you're muted, Judy. Just unmute yourself.
Rather than intersperse the two religions, Sadhu said, wouldn't you want just the pure of one and the other? So we had a long wedding. We first did the Hindu ceremony under a mandap, had a non-alcoholic juice cocktail hour, and then went to the Jewish cemetery. God forbid, the Jewish ceremony under the chuppah.
Mhm.
And so it was long, but
That's fine. I'll make an exception to my half-hour rule for that.
okay.
Ann Cohen, unmute yourself, please.
I'm
There you
unmuted
go.
now.
Yep.
My sister-in-law is Sephardic, and her parents had an arranged marriage. Her father was from Greece, her mother was from Turkey, and it was an arranged marriage. However, her mother had the option of not marrying her father if she didn't want to.
Wow. Sounds similar to what we talked about a few weeks ago on the customs of Yevamot, which is levirate marriage, and chalitza, which is the ritual that invalidates the requirement of levirate marriage. We spent a lot of time on that a
I
few weeks
remember
ago.
that.
I didn't know that custom, and that's very interesting. Arlene also placed a comment in the open chat about having attended Orthodox weddings with parents not under the chuppah. That's very interesting. I don't think it is required by Jewish law. It's one of the many things, most of what is done at weddings is actually not the legal requirements. The legal requirements, just to refresh our memories from a few weeks back, are only three. You got to have a ketubah, you got to have a ring, you got to have a chuppah. That's it. You got a ketubah, ring, chuppah, you say a few words, you've got the whole thing down. Much of
Another thing,
much of the rest is custom. So family standing under the chuppah, while I love it, I do let the bride and groom choose. I would say a majority still choose to have parents standing under the chuppah. There are times when the couple just wants to stand with the officiant, and everybody is sitting facing the chuppah from the pews. It's not a lot.
also they spoke Ladino at home.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, if I only had the time to be an armchair anthropologist observer of the Jewish world, if we all did, I think we would be so enriched by its astonishing diversity. Most of us are still pretty much in an Ashka normative frame, and we are unaware of the vast diversity that resides within Jewish civilization, both historically and today. But even just like spend a few hours at the Jewish Museum in New York City. You're practically living on top of one of the great treasure troves of Jewish life. And there's so many different artifacts and stories that are told there about Jewish customs from around the world. It's one of my favorite places just to go and explore for a few hours. Mom and Dad, and then we'll return to our text. And thank you, Michelle. Correct. There is no requirement that the officiant is a rabbi, as long as we have the other elements, right? So a couple takes the oath and betroths one to the other, or specifically in the Orthodox tradition, groom says the word, and the bride is betrothed and then married to him unilaterally. You don't need a rabbi to conduct the ritual. My role at a wedding is known in the Jewish tradition as misader kiddushin. Misader from seder, which means in order. So a misader is one who organizes or one who orders, one who does the ordering. Kiddushin of the wedding. I'm the wedding organizer. I'm the wedding planner. I mean, literally, that's what the word means. My role is as presumptively one of the more educated Jewish persons in the room, the fact that I'm a professional has no bearing on the matter. Judaism traditionally did not have paid professional religious leaders. That rabbi was a volunteer role until the 19th century. For the most part, rabbis were not getting paid to be rabbis. So my status as rabbi has absolutely no bearing on my authority to solemnize weddings. Having said that, in many, but not all, states in the United States, it is my status as an ordained clergy person that authorizes me to do weddings. New York is one such state. Though actually, as of a year and 2 months ago, New York passed a law that you don't even need to be ordained clergy or a recognized civil servant. You just need to petition the state for a license to marry couples. You don't need to get a universal life church ordination online or any of that. You do have to petition, though. Some states, like California, I can fly to California, get off a plane, and 5 minutes later meet the couple and marry them then and there with no proof of my qualifications. So some states are more lax. Some states, like New York, are much more strict. And marriage in the United States is a state's jurisdiction matter with certain federal provisions and protections, right? So under the Defense of Marriage, when the Supreme Court struck down the Defense of Marriage Act in, I think, June of 2015. So we're celebrating the 10-year anniversary this June, which is Pride, of the striking down of the Defense of Marriage Act. That made it legally acceptable to be, or legally, you cannot contravene a gay couple's right to be married in any of the 50 states. That's a federal protection. But the actual way in which marriage is legally solemnized is different from one state to the next. So when I do a wedding like on Cape Cod, which I often do, or the Berkshires, which I often do, I have to petition the Secretary of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, a fellow named William Galvin. There's a form I have to fill out online. They send me a form. I have to fill out the form with proof that I am a rabbi. And they send me a document with a gold seal of the Secretary of the Commonwealth that says, Rabbi Jonathan Blake of 12 Earlwood Drive in White Plains is authorized for one day to solemnize the marriage vows of this one couple. And then I have to bring that petition or that form that authorizes me as a solemnizer in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to the wedding, help the couple sign the license, fill that out, return that with the original sealed, paper with the gold seal on it back to the Commonwealth's office. If this sounds like a rigmarole, it's a total rigmarole. Every state, it's different. Mom and dad.
The other feature I remember of your sister's wedding was something called a men's tish, where we all sat around and drank a huge amount of single malt scotch before the wedding.
Yes. So one of the mitzvot, commandments that is associated with Jewish weddings is to cause the bride and groom to rejoice. And in Orthodox circles especially, that is taken with the force of mitzvah. And in many Orthodox communities, if not all, drinking is not only permitted but encouraged as a quick and dirty means to getting happy. So on days of the Jewish calendar, whether it is like Simchat Torah or Purim, or occasions of the Jewish life cycle like weddings or brises or even Shabbos, drinking is actually encouraged as a way of fulfilling the mitzvah of causing joy to happen, particularly to cause the bride and groom to rejoice. So yeah, so again, in modern or in traditional Orthodoxy, ceremonies and celebrations often include a segregation of genders for most of the celebration. So the men tend to do their own thing by themselves, the women tend to do their own thing by themselves. Drinking is culturally more associated with the men than the women, but it is very much part of Orthodox custom that the groom or the groom's parents or the groom's father or the groom's, friends would sponsor what's called a tish, which means a table where you all sit around. And the idea is that you're heavily drinking and the groom is supposed to teach Torah. And all of his friends, and it's like the kind of bachelor party on the day of. And all of the men are supposed to interrupt him and get him to crack up. I don't think that is a worldwide Jewish custom, but it's a prominent Eastern European Jewish custom. It's a prominent Ashkenazi custom of a groom's tish, tish being the Yiddish or German word for a table. Where does the custom come from when the last child is married in a family? There's a special dance. Yeah, isn't that called a mazinka? Mom, you did a mazinka, right? When Becky got married? It was, I have to find that out, Barbara, but if you Google mazinka, I don't know how to spell it. I've seen it a few times. It's probably on the internet. Okay, let's read a little bit further and different. Because then, by the way, if you were to continue, it's very interesting. If you were to continue reading Ketubot, Tractate Ketubot, page 8a and following, there are all sorts of maisas, anecdotes that are told about rabbis who only said 6 blessings and was that a legal wedding and all of these things. Okay. Now we're going to get into, as I said, a little bit more of the philosophies around marriage and what's the point of all of this? Like, obviously, the idea that you're recreating the joy of the Garden of Eden and anticipating the joy of the messianic redemption, that's very nice for a poetic expression under a chuppah. But I don't know. I've been married for later this month. I'll celebrate 23 anniversaries of our wedding, and Kelly and I would think, would submit that it's not all like, joyful messianic redemption. That's not really the stuff of married life. So the rabbis do, elsewhere in the Talmud, offer some insights into how they thought about marriage. So we've jumped over to tractate Yevamot. Again, that is actually the whole Talmudic tractate is nominally about levirate marriage, but don't read too much into a Talmudic tractate's title. The Talmud, the format and the style is very discursive. tangents are the main thing. Okay. Matnitin de la Rabbi Yoshua. We're picking up in the middle of a conversation. Don't worry too much about what's come before it. It's a little bit thorny. But the Mishnah, Matnitin, what is taught in the Mishnah, de lav Rabbi Yoshua. So the Mishnah is actually not in accordance with Rabbi Yehoshua's opinion. Ditanya. He taught, and again, in a Baraita, Ditanya is the Aramaic form of Tanu, Ditanya, as he taught. Rabbi Yehoshua Omer, Rabbi Joshua says, Nasa Adam Isha biyalduto. A person takes a wife, Nasa Adam, right, a man, takes a wife, literally lifts up a wife, Nasa, lovely word, Isha biyalduto, in his youth. So if a person takes his wife in his youth, Isa Isha beziknuto, he should marry another woman in his old age. Now, this is not, you have to know what's in between the lines. Steinsaltz helps us. And she passed away. In other words, so a person becomes a widower, right? He married a woman young, they have a married life together, and then she dies. Here, Rabbi Joshua advises he should marry again. In other words, being married is more than optional in the way traditional Jews or traditional Judaism thinks about it. Go on. Hayulo banim b'yalduto. If he had children, or specifically sons, but banim could be sons or children. Hayulo banim b'yalduto. So if he had children when he was, if you want to know more about b'yalduto, just look at the inside word here. B'yeled. A yeled is a child, right? You probably know that if you know a little baby Hebrew. So if he had children when he was young, when he was a child, yulo vanim beziknuto. He should sire more children when he is old. Shenemar, as it is written, Baboker zara et zarecha. In the morning plant your seed, vila erev al tanach yadecha. And in the evening do not withhold thy hand. Ki enecha yodea, for you never know. Ki enecha yodea, you do not know. Eze yichshar azeh ozeh, because you don't know which one will prosper. Literally, which one will be kosher. Yichshar. See the word kosher right there? You don't know whether this will be fit or not. Zeh ozeh. Ve'im shnehem ke'echad tovim. Or if both alike shall be good. In other words, when it comes to the mitzvah of having kids, the rabbis engage in a long-form debate. What constitutes this mitzvah of what is known in the Jewish tradition as Peru Urevu, which is a direct quote from Genesis chapter 1. After we learn in chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, that God created humankind, male and female, God created them in the likeness of the divine. Familiar stuff, right? You should know this. It goes on to say, Pru urvu umil'u et haaretz v'chivshuha. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. I prefer tend to it. Not rule over it ruthlessly, but rather it is assumed that as human beings, you have a responsibility to care for the world. One entrusted to us by, as it were, God's self, by the divine. So the intention, at least in Genesis, is that we have a presumptive responsibility for the care of the whole world. Big, big responsibility. Not that it is ours to do with willy-nilly as we please. And among the responsibilities that are assigned to humankind, right there in the Torah and in chapter 1, no less, is Pru urvu milu et haaretz. So be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So how much is bringing children into the world incumbent on a person? And since remember that all of the negative mitzvot, all of the thou shalt nots of the Torah are incumbent on men and women equally, right? Women, just because they are lesser in the patriarchal framework of Torah law, does not mean that they are exempt from negative mitzvot. Women can't say, "Oh, I'm a woman. I didn't know thou shalt not steal applied to me." No. A thou shalt not, women and men are equally culpable. A thou shalt is incumbent only on men, with three exceptions. Women have, so there are many things that men must do that women don't have to, right? So men must, for instance, circumcise their children and themselves. That is incumbent on the father, not on the mother. Um, Men must pray 3 times a day. Men have to learn Torah. All of these things in traditional Judaism are not incumbent on women. It's not necessarily a violation if they do participate in these mitzvot, but it's definitely not incumbent on them. With the three exceptions, women are charged with setting up the Eruv before Shabbos, uh, taking the challah offering out of the dough before baking the bread, and lighting the Shabbos candles. So interestingly, all three things pertaining to getting ready for Shabbat, all more or less delineating boundaries that have to do with the domain of the domestic household stuff. Shabbos household stuff, three positive mitzvot incumbent on women. Nevertheless, the basic frame of the Talmud is that when we are talking about mitzvot, things that you must do in Jewish life, we're talking to men. Even when it's not said, it is assumed, it's implicit in the text. Okay, that's really important for here because we're really talking about, it never says, well, the mitzvah of having children being incumbent on women. It's kind of ironic given the fact that they are the childbearing unit in a couple, but the mitzvah is actually incumbent on the man to have children or to sire children. But then there's a debate. Well, suppose you have children with your first wife and then she dies, then what? And at least Rabbi Joshua opines, no, he should get married again because marriage is itself a very important mitzvah. It's not optional behavior in Jewish life. Hence, by the way, arranged marriages in traditional communities. It's not that it's not really about love. This is about fulfilling God's design for the world. It is in the category of mitzvah no less than lighting Shabbat candles, studying Torah, observing Shabbat, all the thou shalt marry. And so this rabbi at least believes that if you are married and then widowed, you are obligated to marry again. And then he gives this nice verse from Ecclesiastes to say, no, 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 if you planted your seed in the morning, and not only that, you should have children again. Because if you planted your seed in the morning, you should probably not stint from planting your seed in the evening, which is what the text poetically says. And so, okay, does this really happen? I don't know. I was recently approached by exactly this kind of situation couple. There's a member of our congregation who's probably in his mid-60s. He became a widower about 9 years ago. His wife died after a long battle with cancer. She was only in her 60s at the time. So probably, actually, my congregant is probably a very robust young 70s. And he's been with another woman for several years. And, I think they're going to get married. And she approached me because we were at a wedding together for friends of theirs, family friends. And she said, I want to get a get. And I said, great, we'll get you one. Because she was divorced. So her ex-husband is still living. And technically she needs a get. And I said, just to make it clear though, one, as a Reform rabbi, I don't require this. And she's like, no, 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 I want one. It's spiritually meaningful to me. And I said, okay. I said, I'm going to ask this just as your rabbi. I said, are you planning to have kids? Because that's actually what a get is about. And I said, I actually said, I'm going to go out on a limb and assume you're not planning on having children. So I know that in the real world, couples that are getting married a second or third time or getting married much later in life may not have children in the picture, despite what the Talmud says here. We'll read on, though. The plot thickens. So as you can see from Steinsaltz, he sums it up. This verse indicates that a man should continue having children even after he has fulfilled the mitzvah to be fruitful and multiply. A really interesting follow-up paragraph now. Rabbi Akiva Omer. So we haven't heard from him today, But Rabbi Akiva always has something interesting to contribute. Lamad Torah b'yalduto, if one studied Torah in his youth, Yilmod Torah beziknuto, he should continue studying Torah in his old age. Now, is this just a riff? Is he just ad-libbing? Is he improving on the subject? Oh, we're talking about having kids when you're young and having kids when you're old. Well, let's talk about learning Torah. And Akiva is a really interesting exemplar of this because elsewhere in the Talmud we learn that Akiva didn't pick up a Torah or didn't learn anything. He didn't know an aleph from a bet until he was, does anyone know how old? Jane, you're nodding. How old was Akiva when he started learning? Any guesses? The story is he was 40 years old before he even started learning. Good job. Um, and then when asked about it by a pupil who was kind of despondent that he hadn't started learning until older, Akiva said, "Look, I wasn't 40 till I learned an aleph from a bet, and it's like water dripping on a stone." He says, one drop at a time, and eventually a trickle of water can cut through even the hardest rock, right? He said that's what Torah's like. He says you just allow it to keep dripping and dripping and dripping, and eventually it carves its way deep into your soul. I love that. Okay, so he says, well, okay, while we're on the subject, kind of, one who learned Torah as a youth should continue learning Torah as an older person. Hayulo talmidim b'yalduto, if one had pupils as a youth, iulo talmidim b'ziknuto, he should continue to have pupils in his youth. Shenemar, what's the proof text for this? As is written, Baboker zra et zarecha vagomer. Now here's what's interesting. He's using the same verse from Ecclesiastes. In the morning, plant thy seed, and in the evening, do not withhold your hand. Right? So he's using a text. One uses it literally, more literally, and says, no, I mean, it's all metaphor. One says, in the morning, plant thy seed, plant your seed, and do not withhold your hand when evening comes. That's the verse from Ecclesiastes. For one rabbi, Rabbi Joshua, this means if you had children as a youth, have them again. For Rabbi Akiva, he says, no, this is about learning Torah. And this is an opportune moment for me just to show you a complementary text. And there are many, many others. I'll show you one other, and then we'll jump to my concluding text for today, and then we're back at it next week, joyfully, I hope. So this is from Yevamot 63b. So I've just jumped one page forward. Amru lo leven azai. They, meaning a community of scholars, the rabbis, the group of sages, said to Ben Azai, Yesh na'eh doresh v'na'eh mekayem. Says there's a type of person, there's a type of scholar, na'eh doresh. He gives a nice drash. Na'eh doresh, right? He's good at preaching. He's really good at talk. V'na'eh mekayem. And he's also good at upholding what he talks about. So in other words, we would say he talks the talk and walks the walk, right? There's a person who has lovely speech and he's actually good at doing it. Then there's another kind of person, na'eh mekayem ve'en na'eh doresh. There's a person who just walks the walk even if he doesn't talk the talk. Ve'ata, and you, Ben Azai, they're pointing a finger, say, na'eh doresh. You talk the talk. You're good at making a drash. Ve'en na'eh mekayem, but you don't follow your own advice. What do we know about Ben Azai? We know that even in old age, he was a venerated scholar who obviously was deeply immersed in Talmud law, but who never had children. And he says, well, aren't you a hypocrite? His colleagues, his pupils are saying, wait a minute, you talk the talk about pru uravu, being fruitful and multiplying, and he says, but you're not doing it. Amar lahen Ben Azai said to them, Umaaseh, what am I supposed to do? Shenafshi chashka b'Torah, my soul longs for Torah. Efshar leolam sheyitkayem al yedei acherim, and it is possible for the world to be maintained by others. In other words, he's saying, I'm okay with my role here in the world. I'm here to teach Torah. I don't, the world will go on. Children will be born into the world. And if I don't personally fulfill that mitzvah, that does not mean that I have somehow fouled out. That's an interesting line. And I want to show you one more comment. All right, so there are numerous Jewish traditions, and this is the around this subject, and this is the other one. Rabbi, I'm going to do it just in English for the interest of time. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani says that Rabbi Yonatan says, anyone who teaches another person's son Torah, the verse ascribes him credit as if he himself sired him. Now these are the generations of Aaron and Moses is written in the Torah in Numbers chapter 3, verse 1, and it is written immediately afterward, and these are the names of the sons of Aaron. This is a rabbinic principle of hermeneutic or meaning making out of text, where if you can take one verse and it's adjacent to another verse, and even though they appear to say two very different things, they're actually connected not just by their adjacency, but in their meaning. So in verse 1, we're talking about the generations of Aaron and Moses, and then it goes on to talk about their sons. Nadav the firstborn, Avihu, Eleazar, and Itamar, but it does not mention the names of Moses' children. So what are you supposed to learn from this? This serves to say, sorry, to you, that Aaron sired his children, but Moses taught them Torah. Therefore, the children of Aaron were also known by Moses' name. That is, don't get too hung up on the proof text. The master principle is that in Jewish tradition, yes, bringing children into the world is considered a mitzvah. And because it is chronologically the first mitzvah in the Torah, Genesis chapter 1, it is considered a, if not the paramount mitzvah. And alongside, there is much Jewish teaching that holds that teaching Torah is the equivalent of bringing children into the world. If you teach another person's child Torah, you are what we call yotze. That's a term that you may remember from my first Mishnah class from a few years ago. Yotze means released of one's obligation. If you teach Torah to somebody else's child, that person becomes your own. If you're sitting here wondering, does Blake relate to this as a human being, as a person who is a rabbi and who also does not have children of his own? The answer is yes. Quite meaningfully for me. Like for me, the privilege of teaching Torah to generations of children is just one of the most beautiful and rewarding aspects of what I get to do in my life. And the fact that this past weekend I got to stand under a chuppah with a boy, a man that I've known since he was 8 years old, and stood with him and danced at his bar mitzvah, and have, helped him and his loved ones grieve their loved ones, and now wasn't asked by the groom, which rarely happens, because usually brides get to decide who the rabbi is. But I was asked by the groom, would I fly to Washington to, help Harry say his marriage vows to Andrea under the chuppah? Yeah, man, it's amazing that I get to do that. And there's a little football on the top shelf of my office here. I don't know if you can see it. Do you see it there? This little mini football. So this was the souvenir at Harry's bar mitzvah. There he and I are. He was my groom from this past weekend. So this was the little giveaway at the Harry Jennings bar mitzvah. He now goes by Harrison, of course. Um, but just thank you for allowing me to connect with this text and share a little bit personally as well.
And we are your children as well.
I don't just mean youth, by the way.
Well, it's an honor for your parents to learn from their son. It always has been. God willing, it will be for some time in the future. And I just want to say, with all parental pride, I thought your exegesis today on some of the text was just brilliant.
Thanks. Thank you.
We all feel that way about Jonathan
Thank you.
and what you're capable of.
Look, I mean, just speaking now really personally, like I not, over time I've come to terms with the fact that um, legacy is something in which a lot of people invest a lot of psychic energy. Um, who's going to carry my name? Who's going to carry my genes? Who's going to carry my legacy forward? The fact of the matter is, and I don't mean to be cynical. I'm really not. I'm just trying to be rational. The last generation of people that I feel any spiritual connection with is my great grandparents. I know a little of their story. I have one meaningful artifact in my office, two actually. The tallis and tefillin that you can see on the shelf there belong to my great grandfather Louis Kleinerman, my dad's mom's dad, right? So I know a little of his story. I found the ship manifest from 1903 or 1904. He came over on, I know a little bit about his children, but that's it. Three generations, man. Like,
Right.
unless you're Mozart or, Philip Roth, I don't know if I'm gonna leave behind much of anything that more than three generations down the road people will remember. Um, but
Yeah.
I'm like I feel really really grateful that there will presumably after I'm dead there will be a bunch of people who learn Torah with me. So that's very comforting to me.
Yes.
Thank you, my friends.
Okay.
All right.
Wonderful.
See you next
Yes.
week. Bye.
Yashikoa.
Bruchim to you. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.